He was just a single dad trying to survive the winter, until he saw two tiny footprints leading onto the ice and none coming back. That moment changed everything. What happened next, no one could have predicted. Not the miracle, not the love, and certainly not the 10 luxury SUVs that rolled into his life days later. Before we begin this extraordinary story of courage, kindness, and second chances, if you believe that even the smallest act of goodness can change a life, consider subscribing to our channel. We tell true, inspired stories that warm the heart and remind us of what still matters: love, faith, and the power of standing up when no one else will. The wind whistled through the cracks in the old wooden window panes, tugging at the corners of the faded curtains like an impatient child. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent sheets, burying the fields in white, smoothing over every rough edge of Jack Hawthorne's weathered world. Inside the small farmhouse, Jack stirred a pot of venison stew on the stove, the savoury scent battling the creeping chill. His flannel shirt, patched at the elbows, hung loose on his lean frame. Life had whittled him down to essentials, just enough to keep going, no more, no less. Charlie, boots off at the door, he called out without turning. A pair of snow-crusted boots dropped with a heavy thud, followed by the rhythmic stomping of a 10-year-old trying to shake off winter. "Dad," Charlie said breathlessly, "I saw something weird by the lake." Jack paused, wooden spoon mid-air. "Weird how?" There were footprints, little ones, leading toward the ice. But they didn't come back. Jack's hand tightened around the spoon. He set it down gently, grabbed his coat from the hook, and was at the door in 3 strides. "Show me." The lake lay just beyond the tree line behind their barn, a glassy expanse swallowed by the storm. Snow still fell hard, but Jack could make out the tiny tracks, 2 sets of them, side by side, almost too small to be real. "Could be deer," he muttered, kneeling, but his breath caught in his throat. No hoofprints, no animal, just 2 sets of child-sized boots straight out toward the center of the frozen lake, and nothing coming back. Without a word, Jack took off running. The ice groaned under his weight. It was early winter, too early for a solid freeze. Every step felt like a negotiation between life and death. "Hello!" he shouted into the howling wind. "Is anyone out there?" Then he heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, like a child sobbing from beneath a blanket. He dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to the ice. "Help!" The scream was muffled and distant, but it was real, and it was directly beneath him. Jack didn't think. He didn't calculate odds or wait for rescue. He raised the butt of his elbow and slammed it into the ice again and again until the surface cracked in a spiderweb pattern, then shattered with a great roar as freezing water surged up around him. He plunged in. The cold stole his breath like a punch to the chest, but he fought down the panic. He could see them. 2 little girls, eyes wide in terror, trapped beneath the surface. He reached out, heart pounding. His numb fingers scraped glassy ice, searching for purchase, for a way in. One hand latched onto a thin wrist, then another. He pulled with everything he had. When Charlie saw his father go under, he ran faster than he ever had in his life. The snow stung his face, but he didn't stop until he found the emergency radio in the barn. "2 girls!" he shouted into the speaker, hands shaking. "My dad's in the lake! He jumped in! Please send someone!" By the time the paramedics arrived, Jack had managed to drag both girls to the edge. He was slumped over, soaked to the bone, cradling the unconscious children in his arms. His lips were blue, his body shaking uncontrollably, but he refused to let go. The first paramedic knelt beside him. "Sir, we've got it now." Jack shook his head. Don't let them get cold again." Later, in the warmth of the hospital's emergency room, A nurse offered Jack a blanket and hot coffee. Charlie sat beside him, his small hand gripping his father's with surprising strength. "Are they going to be okay?" Charlie asked. Jack looked toward the room where the girls were being examined. Their coats had been worn thin, their skin pale and marked with early frostbite, but they were alive. "I think so," Jack said softly. "They're safe now." "What about their parents?" That question hung in the air like breath in winter. No one had come looking for them. No one had called. The girls hadn't said much, just their names. Rosie and Willa, twins, sisters. When asked who their mother was, Rosie had only whispered, "She's crying, somewhere in the trees back at the farmhouse that night." Jack couldn't sleep. Charlie lay on the couch, curled under a blanket. The fire crackled, casting flickering light on the old wood-panelled walls. Jack stood at the window, staring out toward the lake, now hidden beneath darkness and a fresh layer of snow. He didn't know what kind of world would allow two little girls to wander alone into the ice. He didn't know who they belonged to or why no one was looking for them. But he did know one thing. They hadn't died today. And sometimes that was enough to start again. Jack hadn't slept. Not a real sleep, just fragments of dreams and memories, flickering like dying embers in a stove that refused to catch fire. At 4:12 a.m., he gave up pretending. He pulled on his boots, shrugged into his old coat, and stepped out into the cold Wyoming morning. The air bit at his face, the sky ink black and starless. The lake glimmered in the distance like a wound barely scabbed over. Behind him, the farmhouse stood silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood or Charlie's soft breathing. But something about the night felt unfinished, like a sentence left hanging in mid-air. The hospital had released the twins just hours earlier. Their vitals had stabilized. No signs of brain damage. A miracle, the nurse had said, though Jack didn't believe in miracles. Not anymore. They were asleep now, curled up on the pull-out sofa in the living room, small hands clasped, even in their dreams, as if afraid the other might vanish. Jack had offered them the warmest spot in the house, stoked the fire to its brightest, and stayed nearby all evening. Neither girl had asked for toys or a story. They had only asked one question. "Will she find us?" When Jack gently asked who she was, Rosie had looked up at him with ancient eyes for a 6-year-old and said, "Mommy was crying, but she told us to run." Standing by the frozen lake now, Jack felt the weight of their silence more than the snow. He scanned the tree line, empty. The girls hadn't mentioned a name, a location, a destination, only that their mother was out there. Crying, he squatted by the edge of the lake, tracing the place where the ice had shattered, now frozen again under a new sheet of snow. The thought of them, trapped beneath that surface, their small fingers pressed against the ice. It twisted something deep inside him. "Why were they alone out here?" he murmured aloud. "Where the hell were you?" The wind didn't answer. By the time Jack returned to the farmhouse, dawn was stretching across the sky, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. He stomped off his boots quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. But someone was already awake. Rosie sat at the kitchen table, her tiny legs swinging back and forth, wearing one of Charlie's old hoodies. Her face was still pale, lips dry, but her eyes were sharp. "I had a bad dream," she said softly, "but it was a real one." Jack poured her a glass of warm milk and sat down across from her. "Want to tell me about it?" Rosie hesitated. Then there was yelling. Mommy said to run. She was scared. Jack leaned forward. "Where were you before the lake?" "Snow, trees, a car that wouldn't start." He frowned. "Did your mum have a phone?" "She threw it." That caught him off guard. "She threw it?" Rosie nodded, as if it were the most natural thing. She said someone was following us. Then she told me and Willa to run toward the water. She said it was safer than staying with her." Jack exhaled slowly. Something in him, the instincts that had once saved lives as a firefighter, began to stir again. She wasn't just lost, she was hiding. Later that morning, Jack loaded the kids, Charlie, Rosie, and Willa, into his battered pickup and headed into town. He didn't want to call child services yet, not until he knew more, not until he knew the mother wasn't in danger. At the sheriff's station, he filled out a brief report. The deputy, a younger guy with too much cologne and not enough empathy, nodded vaguely. "We'll put out a bulletin," he said. "See if anyone's filed a missing persons. But if no one's reported them gone, maybe she left them, man." Jack stared at him. "She didn't leave them." The deputy shrugged. "You'd be surprised how often it happens." Jack left without saying another word. Back at the farm, the girls played with Charlie in the hayloft, laughter echoing like something sacred. Jack stood in the barn doorway, arms crossed, heart caught in his throat. He hadn't heard that kind of laughter in years, not since Emily left. Charlie was different with the girls, gentler, more expressive, as if something inside him had awakened. Something Jack hadn't known was missing. But there was no forgetting the look in Rosie's eyes. That knowing, that trauma, too heavy for a child. Just after sundown, as Jack chopped wood out back, he saw her. A figure at the edge of the trees, small, hunched, unmoving. He froze, heart thudding. The axe slipped from his hand. The figure took one shaky step forward. She looked like a ghost. Her hair tangled, coat ripped at the sleeves, face streaked with cold and tears. Her eyes locked onto his, haunted, hollow. Then she whispered, hoarse and broken, "Are they safe?" She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Eliza Monroe stood at the edge of Jack's property like a deer on the edge of a highway, ready to bolt, but too exhausted to move. Her clothes clung to her frame, damp and wind-torn, and there were scratches on her hands, a rip in one knee of her jeans, and her lips were chapped so badly they bled. But it was her eyes that stopped Jack. They were wild with fear and filled with something even deeper than that. Shame. He took a cautious step forward. "They're safe," he said gently. "Inside. Warm." Eliza swayed, then steadied herself against a low-hanging pine branch. Her breath puffed wide into the cold evening air. "Both of them." He nodded. "Both." She covered her mouth with both hands, and for a moment her body just folded in on itself, shoulders shaking. Not from cold, but from release. "They're okay," she whispered. "They're really okay." Jack wanted to ask 100 questions. Why she'd run. Why she'd sent 2 little girls across a frozen lake. Why she hadn't come sooner. But none of that mattered. Not right now. The important thing was that she was here, alive, and asking about her daughters. He took off his coat and held it out. "You look like you're freezing." She hesitated, then took it. Her hands trembled as she slid it on, the sleeves hanging too long on her arms. She clutched the collar like it was armor. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. "I was just trying to keep them safe." Jack looked at her for a long moment. "You did," he said. "They're safe now." Back inside the farmhouse, the moment Eliza walked through the door, the room seemed to hold its breath. Rosie and Willow were playing quietly with Charlie near the fire. When they saw her, their faces lit up in tandem. "Mummy!" Both girls launched themselves at her with small cries that could have broken the coldest heart. Eliza dropped to her knees and gathered them in her arms, sobbing freely now. Her fingers ran over their hair, their cheeks, their hands, touching them as if to prove they were real. My babies. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. They clung to her like ivy to a wall, whispering, "We knew you'd come." And we waited, Mummy. Jack stood by the kitchen counter, watching the reunion with something heavy and indescribable sitting on his chest. For a moment he thought of Emily, how she'd walked out one night and never came back, how Charlie had waited by the window for weeks, and how no one ever came for them. But here someone had. Later, after the girls had fallen asleep curled against her on the couch, Jack brought Eliza a mug of tea. She looked at it as though it might burn her. Still, she took it with a soft, "Thank you." They sat across from each other in the quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow had slowed to a soft whisper. "I should have come sooner," she said, staring into the flames. "But I wasn't sure if it was safe." Jack didn't push. He waited. "My name's Eliza Munro," she said after a long silence. "You've probably heard it, or maybe you haven't." Jack furrowed his brow. "Munro? Like the hotels?" She gave a hollow chuckle. "Exactly like the hotels. My father built the empire. My late husband helped run it. And I was supposed to inherit it all, but I walked away." Jack took that in. The name meant nothing to him personally. He hadn't stayed in anything fancier than a roadside motel in 10 years. But he understood the weight of legacy and the burden of being expected to play a part in someone else's script. "I married a man who kept our lives polished on the outside," she continued. "But underneath, he was broken. And he broke things, slowly, quietly, mostly me." She looked up, eyes red but steady. "He passed away 3 years ago in a car accident. Everyone thought it was tragic. But for me and the girls, it was complicated." Jack nodded once. He didn't speak. He knew what it meant to love someone and lose them, and still not be sure whether the grief came from love or relief. "I tried to rebuild," Eliza said, "but his former business partner, someone I trusted, started showing up too often, saying too many things, making threats about custody, about what was best for my girls. And I knew we had to get out." "So you ran," Jack said softly. She looked at him, eyes glistening. "I didn't know where I was going, just away. Far. Until the car died in the snow, and I panicked. I didn't think anyone would believe me if I told the truth. So I told the girls to run. Toward the light, I thought. I thought maybe someone would find them." "You thought right," he said. For a long moment, they just sat there. Two strangers, two survivors, two people who had once known fire and now lived in the ashes of what came after. Then Eliza said almost to herself, "You didn't have to do what you did. You didn't have to go into that lake." Jack stared into his tea. "Yeah, but they didn't have to be in that lake either." When she looked at him again, something had shifted in her eyes. Not just gratitude, something deeper, like trust, taking its first cautious step. "Thank you, Jack Hawthorne," she said, "for not asking questions when I had no answers." He stood. "You don't owe me anything." But Eliza shook her head, tears threatening again. "I owe you everything." Morning came quietly. No alarms, no voices, just the soft rustle of flannel sheets and the distant caw of a crow perched on the frost-bitten fence post outside. The farmhouse held its breath in that golden hour between first light and full wakefulness, as if even time was reluctant to disturb the peace. Eliza was the first to stir. She lay on the couch, still wrapped in Jack's coat, with Rosie and Willa nestled tightly against her sides like twin vines clinging to a tree. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, her shoulders weren't clenched with fear. Her body, though aching, had allowed itself to rest. She blinked toward the fire. It had been kept alive through the night. Someone had fed it more logs while she slept. Jack. She sat up slowly, not wanting to wake the girls. On the coffee table beside her lay a folded blanket, a cup of water, and a short, handwritten note. "Take the morning. They're safe, Jay." She read it twice. Simple, quiet, and impossibly kind. In the kitchen, Jack stood over the stove, flipping pancakes with the kind of skill that only came from years of necessity. Charlie sat at the table, swinging his legs and reading a comic book, his hair sticking up in every direction. "You didn't have to make breakfast?" Eliza said, stepping in, her voice still rough from sleep. Jack looked over his shoulder, spatula in hand. "You didn't have to say thank you," he replied, and turned back to the pan. She allowed herself a small smile. "Then I guess we're even," Charlie grinned. "Mom never made pancakes like this." Jack nudged him with a knuckle. "That's because your mum never liked waking up early." Eliza's eyes flickered. She didn't ask, but Jack caught the glance. He poured more batter onto the skillet. "She left when Charlie was 6. Walked out one night. Didn't say goodbye. We haven't seen her since." Eliza's lips parted slightly. "I'm so sorry." He shrugged. "We've got what we need," Charlie chimed in without looking up. "Yeah, we've got pancakes." They ate around the small wooden table. Jack, Eliza, Charlie, Rosie, and Willa, a group of strangers, slowly becoming something else. The twins were still a little quiet, still holding onto their mother's sleeves while they chewed. But their eyes were brighter. Their laughter came more freely now, especially when Charlie told a joke about cows and spaceships that made no logical sense, but got giggles anyway. After breakfast, Jack slipped on his boots and coat. "I'll go check the water line near the barn. Pipes have a habit of freezing if I so much as blink wrong." "I'll come with you," Eliza offered, before she could second-guess herself. Jack raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You sure? I think I need the air, and maybe I want to see what survival looks like outside of spreadsheets and board meetings." Charlie wrinkled his nose. "What's a spreadsheet?" Jack smirked. "A tool adults use to pretend they're in control," Eliza chuckled. "He's not wrong." Outside, the snow crunched beneath their boots. The air was sharp, but the sun peeked through the clouds in pale ribbons, softening the edges of everything. Jack led her past the barn toward the older outbuilding, where the water pipes wound like metal veins beneath the earth. "You've done a lot with very little," she said, glancing around. "Depends who you ask," Jack replied. "Some folks see a broken fence. I see a fence that still stands." She nodded, thoughtful. "I used to think success meant skyscrapers, private jets. But I look at this place and think, maybe I got it wrong." Jack stopped beside the pipe housing, squatting to check the line. "This place was built by my grandfather's hands. Every nail, every board. He taught me that life doesn't ask for flash. It asks for steady." Eliza stood beside him in silence. That word, steady, echoed in her chest. She'd built a life on momentum, on power lunches and red-eye flights and headlines, but in all that speed, she'd never once felt still, never once felt safe. Until now, as they walked back to the house, she said quietly, "I'm not sure how long we can stay." Jack didn't answer right away. "You don't have to figure it all out today. I'm not used to not having answers. You're a mum. You've already given the most important answer there is." She tilted her head. "What's that?" "That they're worth everything." He said it without flinching, without expecting anything in return. And it undid something in her. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Eliza stood at the window in the living room, gazing out at the snow-covered pasture. Jack sat in the armchair behind her, mending a tear in Charlie's coat with careful, calloused fingers. "They've stopped asking if we're going home," she said softly. Jack looked up. "Do you want to?" She didn't answer right away. Then she turned toward him. No, not yet. He nodded. Then don't. She crossed the room, sat across from him on the ottoman. I never said thank you. Not really. You don't need to. I do. She took a breath. You saved them and me without even knowing who we were. Jack looked at her, steady as ever. Sometimes it doesn't matter who, only that. They sat there in the quiet, the fire between them, two people not yet in love, but moving towards something that felt an awful lot like it. Not with fireworks, not with declarations, but with presence, with kindness, with the kind of thanks that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. That night, the wind picked up again, whistling low and constant across the empty plains, like a hymn only the prairie remembered. Inside the farmhouse, the storm was just a distant murmur behind thick walls and old wood. The living room was quiet. The children had fallen asleep hours ago. Charlie curled up under the patchwork quilt his grandmother had made, and the twins tucked safely in the small guest room Jack had cleared out for them. The fire in the hearth cast long shadows across the floor, flickering like old memories. Eliza sat cross-legged on the braided rug, sipping from a chipped mug of chamomile tea. Jack knelt beside the hearth, feeding another log into the fire. Neither of them spoke for a while, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence between them had grown comfortable, earned, not empty. I always thought fireplaces were just for decoration, Eliza said at last, breaking the stillness. At least the ones we had in New York. They were gas-powered, controlled by remote. Jack smiled faintly. Ain't much comfort in fake flames. No, she said softly. There isn't. She took another sip, then looked into the fire. I used to think control was everything, that if I could organize enough, plan well enough, lead strong enough, I could stop the bad things from happening. Jack stirred the logs gently with the poker. Sparks lifted like fireflies into the chimney. And did it work? Eliza let out a bitter laugh. Not harsh, just tired. Not even close. Jack leaned back against the stone hearth, stretching out his legs. You said your husband passed away 3 years ago. Was it sudden? She nodded. Car accident. Late at night. He'd been drinking. That part was never in the papers, of course. I'm sorry. He was complicated, she said, her voice cautious. To the world, he was charming. Brilliant. But at home, she hesitated. He wasn't cruel. Not in the ways people expect. Just cold. Distant. Controlling in the quietest ways. So quiet I didn't even notice until I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't interrupt. I stayed for the girls, told myself they needed stability. But then I saw how Rosie flinched when voices got too loud, how Willa started hiding under the table when her dad walked in the room. Eliza's eyes glistened. That was my wake-up call. I took them and left. I had money, connections, but I also had a target on my back. Jack rubbed a hand over his face. So you ran, not just from danger, but from everything familiar. She nodded again. And now, I'm here. In a house with broken floorboards, a fire that actually needs tending, and a man who risked his life for my children before he even knew their names. He gave a shrug, almost embarrassed. You showed up in the middle of my winter. I'm sorry for that. Don't be, he said. Winter needed breaking. A long pause followed. The fire popped gently. Somewhere in the hallway, the wooden floor groaned under the weight of time. Then Eliza asked quietly, What about you? You said Charlie's mum left. Jack looked into the fire for a long time before speaking. We met young, married quick. Thought love was something you could build out of promises and baby clothes. But life got harder after Charlie was born. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She said she felt invisible. One day she said she needed a weekend to clear her head. Never came back. I can't imagine, Eliza said, her voice thick with empathy. You find a way to keep going, he said. Mostly for him. At first I kept the porch light on, thinking she might drive up someday. After a year I replaced the bulb. That was my way of letting go. Eliza looked at him, not as a stranger, but as someone who had lived parallel pain. Do you ever wish you could go back and fix it? Jack shook his head. No, but I do wish I'd asked more questions while I still had the chance. The clock ticked past midnight. Neither moved to leave. Then Jack stood slowly. There's something I want to show you. She followed him through the narrow hallway and into the small den at the back of the house. He opened an old cedar chest and carefully pulled out a well-worn journal. This was my father's, he said. He was a fireman too. Wrote in this every day for 20 years. He handed it to her. Eliza opened it gently, flipping past pages filled with faded ink, sketches of tools, handwritten prayers, even a recipe for chili scribbled in the margins. He always said, a man's legacy isn't what he builds, it's what he leaves behind for someone else to carry. She closed the book, holding it carefully like something sacred. That's beautiful. I used to think I didn't have anything to leave behind. Now I'm not so sure. She looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. Not quite love, not yet, but the first stirrings of something real, something that could take root in the soil of shared scars and quiet courage. Back in the living room, the fire had died down to embers. I should let you rest, Jack said. Eliza hesitated, then nodded. Thank you for tonight, for everything. He gave her a long look. You're not a burden here, Eliza. She swallowed hard. That might be the kindest thing anyone said to me in years. Then she turned and walked down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wood floor. Jack watched her disappear into the dark, then sat down beside the fire, his fingers still warm from where they'd brushed hers when she closed the journal. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The quiet didn't last. It never does. Not when someone's past is built on headlines and inheritance. It started with a humming in the air. Not something Jack could explain, just a shift in the way the wind moved across the field. A pressure behind his ears, like the silence before a storm. He was out by the barn, mending the gate that Charlie had knocked loose with the sled the day before, when he heard it. Engines. Not the old truck kind, smooth, powerful, coordinated. He stood up slowly, squinting toward the horizon. And then he saw them. 10 black luxury SUVs moving in a quiet procession down the snow-covered road, tires crunching softly like whispers in a church. It wasn't just the number of vehicles that raised Jack's pulse. It was the way they moved, deliberate, like a convoy, like someone important was inside. The gate in his hands slipped. Inside the farmhouse, Eliza was standing by the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, humming softly to herself as she washed the breakfast plates. Rosie and Willow were colouring on the floor. Charlie was building a tower out of cereal boxes. Jack walked in fast, his boots still coated in frost. His expression was tight, unreadable. Eliza. She turned, smile fading the instant she saw his face. You need to look outside. She stepped to the window and froze, the colour drained from her face. Oh, God, she whispered. Jack stood beside her, arms crossed. Friends of yours? No, she said, not friends, not even close. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, then turned toward the twins. Girls, come with me. Rosie blinked. Are we leaving? No, sweetie. she said gently. "Just going to the bedroom for a little while. Charlie, would you stay with them?" Charlie nodded, already sensing the tension in the room. Eliza paused before leaving, her hand brushing lightly against Jack's sleeve. "Please, don't let them take me until I've had a chance to explain." When the knock came, it wasn't a hard one. It was polite. 2 raps, sharp, like something you'd hear outside a corporate boardroom instead of a farmhouse door. Jack opened it. The man on the other side wore a long wool coat, grey hair slicked back, a subtle earpiece tucked behind his left ear. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't press. But Jack recognized power when he saw it. "Jack Hawthorne?" the man asked. Jack didn't answer. "I'm Grant Sutherland. I represent the Munro family office. I believe you've been sheltering Eliza Munro and her daughters." Jack leaned against the doorframe. They needed help. "Of course," Sutherland said, nodding slightly. "And now we're here to relieve you of that responsibility." Jack's jaw tensed. "You make it sound like they're a burden." "They're not," Sutherland said calmly. "They're high-profile individuals in a delicate situation. Mrs. Munro has been under significant scrutiny. Our team is here to ensure their return is discreet and safe." Jack glanced past the man. The other SUV sat idle, men in black coats milling about like shadows. Then he saw it. Eliza, standing in the hallway behind him, her shoulders squared, but her hands shaking at her sides. "You can come in," she said, her voice clear but low. "But only if you're here to listen." The living room suddenly felt too small for so many people. Sutherland stood stiffly across from Eliza while Jack remained close, not looming, but present. "You weren't supposed to run," Sutherland said, tone more disappointed than angry. "I wasn't supposed to hand over my children like they were merger assets," Eliza snapped. "He was threatening custody. You knew that. I knew it was complicated." "No," she said, voice rising. "You knew it was dangerous. And you did nothing." Sutherland's silence spoke volumes. Jack stepped forward. "If she doesn't want to go with you, she stays." "You understand that, right?" "This isn't about what she wants," Sutherland said quietly. "It's about what will happen when the media gets wind of this. About the company, the board, the lawsuits waiting to happen." Eliza's voice cut through the room like glass. "Let them come. Let them sue. I'll stand up in every court in America and tell them exactly what I did and why." "And what about the girls?" Sutherland asked. "Do you really think hiding out in the middle of nowhere is a long-term solution?" "No," Jack said calmly. "But sometimes the middle of nowhere is the first place healing starts." Sutherland studied them both, then sighed and pulled out a folder. "I was instructed to offer this. Terms for a return, full public relations cover, control over narrative, private education for the girls, total legal protection." Eliza didn't even look at it. "I have everything I need right here." She reached down, took Jack's hand quietly, without performance, just honesty, strength, and in that moment the balance of power in the room shifted. Sutherland closed the folder. "We'll be in touch." He left without another word. Later that evening, as the last of the SUVs disappeared down the snowy road, Eliza stood on the porch beside Jack. "You didn't have to stand up for me," she said. He glanced sideways. "You didn't have to come back for them." She looked up at the stars. "I used to think I had to choose between being a mother and being free, but maybe freedom was always here, in the quiet, in the people who ask nothing of me but truth." Jack didn't say anything. He just slipped his arm gently around her shoulder. And for the first time in years, Eliza leaned into someone without fear of falling. The next morning, the world looked the same. Snow blanketed the fields in its usual hush. The barn creaked under its own weight, and smoke curled softly from the chimney of the little farmhouse. But inside, everything had changed. Jack knew it the moment he stepped into the kitchen. Eliza was already there, wearing Charlie's oversized flannel shirt over her own clothes, pouring coffee like she'd done it 100 times. Not like a guest, not like someone passing through, like someone who'd stayed. "Morning," she said, offering him a cup. He took it wordlessly, his fingers brushing hers. "You sleep? Like a rock." She smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. Jack took a sip, studying her in the morning light. The tension that had shadowed her face since the day they met was softer now, not gone, but quieter, as if, overnight, she'd laid down a burden she no longer believed was hers to carry alone. She sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around her mug. "You're wondering why I'm still here?" He didn't answer, but she saw the question in his eyes. "Could have gotten into one of those SUVs yesterday," she said. "Gone back to the city, to the glass towers and polite lies, to people who smile while writing checks to control me." Jack raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I didn't." He nodded slowly. "You didn't." A pause settled between them, comfortable but full of things neither had words for yet. Later that day, Eliza bundled up the twins and took them outside to build snowmen with Charlie. From the barn, Jack watched the scene unfold with a quiet ache in his chest. He saw Eliza kneel beside Rosie to help her pack snow, saw Willa fling a snowball with a giggle so pure it cut through the cold, and saw Charlie, laughing like he hadn't in years, as he built a lopsided snow fortress. It looked like a Christmas card, but it felt like home. That evening, Eliza came to Jack with a proposition. "I want to stay longer," she said, standing in the barn doorway, brushing flakes from her sleeves. "Not just for a few days. Maybe weeks. Maybe more." Jack set down the hammer he was using. "There's a room here for you." She stepped inside, her voice more cautious now. "Not just a room. I want to do something real. Something lasting. Not just exist in limbo." Jack leaned against the workbench. "What are you thinking?" She took a breath. "There's a grant program I started, back before everything fell apart. It was meant to fund healing centers for kids in crisis, but the board shelved it after Daniel died." Jack listened, arms crossed, but his eyes intent. "I still have access to the funds. And the land around your farm." She gestured to the open space beyond the windows. "It's perfect, quiet, safe, honest. I want to build something here, a retreat, a sanctuary, for kids like mine, for parents like us." Jack blinked. "You want to build a non-profit on my back, 40? "I want to build a future," she corrected gently, "and I want you to be part of it." The silence that followed wasn't from hesitation. It was from the weight of something true landing between them. "You're serious," he said finally. "I've never been more." Jack let out a low whistle. "You come into my life like a snowstorm, leave 10 black SUVs in your wake, and now you want to start a sanctuary?" Eliza laughed, a sound both defiant and free. "Is that a yes?" He smiled. Slow, steady. "It's a maybe, but it's the kind that leans toward yes." The next few days were filled with plans, sketches on napkins, video calls from Eliza's trusted friend in legal, and questions from Charlie about whether this meant they could build tree houses too. Jack wasn't used to movement, to dreams that reached past tomorrow. But Eliza carried the momentum like she was born to it, and she did it with her sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, and boots caked in snow. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was home one night while the kids slept. They stood outside under a sky so clear it looked like glass. The stars were sharp, endless. "I used to think the stars were for rich people," Jack said, hands in his coat pockets, like city folks had to drive out to places like this to see them. But here, we just look up. Eliza turned to him. I never saw them in the city. Too many lights, too much noise. They've always been there, he said. We just forget to look. She reached out, took his gloved hand. I'm looking now. He looked at her, not just her face, but her heart. He could see it, finally. Not as a CEO, not as a woman on the run, but as Eliza, raw, brave, rebuilding. You're not who I expected, he said, and you're more than I hoped for. They stood there, two people with too much past and just enough future, holding hands in the cold. The next morning, 10 different SUVs arrived. But this time, they weren't here to take anything away. They came with engineers, architects, planners, a project manager named Joe, who wore a cowboy hat and hugged Jack like they were long-lost cousins. And in the middle of it all stood Eliza, not running, not hiding, leading. Jack stood by the fence with Charlie, watching the commotion. You okay with all this? Charlie asked. Jack nodded slowly. I think we're starting something good. Charlie tilted his head. Does this mean Ms. Eliza is staying? Jack looked toward the house where Rosie and Willa waved from the window. He smiled. She never left. Snow fell with a hush that morning, soft and slow, blanketing the world in white like it was being made new again. Jack stood on the porch, sipping hot coffee, as the horizon softened in the pale light of Christmas Eve. He could hear laughter, light, clear, echoing from behind the barn. The kids were already out, bundled in mismatched scarves and boots, rolling snowballs, and trying to build what Charlie called Fort Peace Treaty, because the last snowball fight had ended in tears and hot chocolate. Inside, Eliza was wrapping the last of the handmade gifts in brown paper and red yarn, her hair tucked under a knit hat that Rosie insisted made her look like a cool grandma. She didn't argue. After the week they'd had, laughter was currency, and this house, this strange, creaky, lovely house, was full of it. Jack stepped back inside, brushing snow off his shoulders. You're still wrapping? Eliza looked up, grinning. Perfection takes time. They're kids. You could wrap it in newspaper and duct tape, and they'd still think it's magic. She smirked. Well, then I guess we're raising them wrong. That night, after dinner, venison stew, cornbread, and Eliza's very questionable attempt at gingerbread cookies, they all gathered in the living room. The fire crackled. Stockings hung unevenly from the mantel. A small tree, half decorated by the kids and half finished by Eliza and Jack when they'd gone to bed, twinkled in the corner. I vote presents, Charlie said, eyes wide. You always vote presents, Jack replied. That's because I'm always right. Rosie and Willa clapped in agreement, bouncing on the couch. Eliza passed out the packages. Each child had 2 gifts, one from Eliza, one from Jack. Nothing extravagant, but every package had been chosen, wrapped, and tucked under that tree with care. Charlie unwrapped a pair of brand-new snow boots and a hand-carved wooden slingshot Jack had made in the barn. He held it like it was made of gold. Awesome. Rosie received a sketchbook and a pack of pencils. For drawing dreams, Eliza had said, and a necklace with a small silver heart that Jack had picked up during his last trip to town. Willa gasped when she opened her box, a soft purple scarf with her name stitched into it, and a set of tiny wooden animals, each hand-painted by Jack. It's a zoo. No, Rosie said, solemn. It's a family. Willa beamed. Even better, when the children were finally tucked into bed, after hot cocoa, 1 story apiece, and a rousing pillow fight that nearly took out the tree. Jack and Eliza sat by the fire in silence. They didn't speak for a long while. Outside, the wind had calmed. The world felt still, safe. Jack leaned forward, feeding another log into the flames. "I wasn't sure we'd make it this far," Eliza said, watching the firelight dance across the stone hearth. He looked at her. "Christmas. This. All of it." She rested her chin on her knees, drawn up against her chest. "I thought I'd ruined any chance of normal." Jack shook his head. "Normal's overrated." She smiled faintly. "You ever miss it?" He raised an eyebrow. "Before," she clarified. "Before things got quiet, lonely." He considered that. "Sometimes. Mostly when I hear Charlie laugh and realize I haven't for days. But then I look around and realize the quiet made room for something better." She turned toward him, soft-eyed. "And what's better?" "This," he said. "Them. You." A long beat passed between them. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, wrapped box. I wasn't sure if I should give this to you." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You made me stew and fix the tree. You already gave me Christmas. Just open it." He peeled back the paper slowly. Inside was a pair of leather work gloves, sturdy, weathered, and clearly well kept. "These were Daniel's," she said. "My husband's. He wore them when we started our first Monroe shelter, back before things got too big, too fast." Jack held them carefully, reverently. "You sure?" He believed in doing good with your hands. "I think if he could see this place, see what you're building, not just barns or fences, but family, he'd want you to have them." Jack was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got something for you too." He stood and walked to the bookshelf, returning with a small wooden box. Inside was a harmonica, aged brass, slightly dented, worn smooth around the edges. "My dad's," Jack said. "He played it every night when I was a kid. After dinner, after bad days, after fire calls that didn't end well." Eliza ran her fingers across it. "Does it still play?" "Not well," he chuckled, "but it still hums." She smiled, eyes glassy. "Why me?" Jack looked at her for a long time. Then, "Because you came back. Because you stayed. Because when everything in your life told you to run, you didn't." Her breath caught. "Jack." He shook his head gently. "I don't need a promise. I don't need a plan. I just need this. You. Here." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his, and in the glow of a modest fire, in a farmhouse that had seen more loss than joy, they sat with their gifts. Old, worn, imperfect. Just like them. But together. And that, they both knew, was the miracle. The day after Christmas, the sun rose slow and low, casting golden fingers across the snow-laden fields. A rare warmth lingered in the light, more symbolic than seasonal. But Jack felt it as he watched the frost begin to loosen its grip on the edge of the barn roof. Inside, Eliza was still asleep, curled on the sofa with Rosie's favorite blanket draped across her legs. The girls and Charlie had stayed up late building forts from pillows and storytelling in hushed, giggling tones long after bedtime. Jack stood by the window, one hand resting on the cold glass, eyes fixed on the distant line of trees that marked the edge of his property. Just beyond them was the lake. The place where everything had begun, the place where so much had ended. He didn't go there often, but today he needed to. By mid-morning, Eliza stirred to find a note tucked under her tea mug on the kitchen table. "If you're up for it, meet me by the lake. Dress warm. Jack." No explanations, no pressure. Just an invitation. She smiled faintly, folded the note in half, and began to layer herself against the cold. When she found him, Jack was already there, standing at the lake's edge with his hands in the pockets of his jacket, the same one he'd wrapped around her shoulders that first day. The wind brushed gently through the trees, the lake frozen and still beneath a dusting of snow. Eliza approached slowly, her boots crunching softly over the packed path. "I wasn't sure you'd want to come back here." Jack didn't turn at first. When he did, his voice was low. "Took me 3 years to step back on this bank," her brow furrowed. 3 years. He nodded toward a small clearing off to the right, partially hidden behind a thicket of birch. "That's where I asked Emily to marry me." Eliza followed his gaze but said nothing. She said yes. Or at least, she smiled and hugged me like she meant it. His lips pressed into a thin line. 6 years later, she left. Eliza stepped beside him, her gloved hand grazing his. Jack continued. "I used to come here every December, sit on that rock and ask myself what I'd missed, what I could have done different. Then one year, I stopped asking. Figured some answers don't come." He looked at her. "Then you showed up." Her breath caught. "Not just you. Them. Those girls. Your girls. They were in this lake, the very place that broke me open." Eliza's eyes welled. "Jack!" But when I pulled them out, it was like something thawed. Not just them. Me. They stood in silence for a long moment. The wind moved through the trees like memory, soft, insistent. Then Jack pointed to a bench partially buried in snow. "Wanna sit?" She nodded. They cleared the snow and sat side by side, shoulders brushing. "You didn't just save them, you know," Eliza said. "You saved me too." Jack looked at her, eyes gentle. "You weren't drowning. Not in water," she admitted, "but in everything else." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "You're not the only one." They sat like that for a while, saying more in silence than most people did in speeches. Then Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. "I meant to give you this earlier," he said, unfolding the fabric to reveal a small, delicate snow globe. Inside was a tiny log cabin surrounded by snow-dusted pine trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, and a small figure stood at the door, just barely visible, but unmistakably there. Eliza took it gently. "It's beautiful. My dad gave it to my mum the Christmas after they moved here," Jack said. She hated the cold, said she felt like she was disappearing in it. So he found this in a little antique shop and told her, "Now you can carry home with you, even in a storm." Her fingers tightened around the glass. Jack met her gaze. "You've been through a lot of storms, Eliza, but you're still standing, still showing up. And if you want to stay here, if you want this place to be part of what comes next, then it's your home too." Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. "I never expected this," she whispered. Jack smiled. "None of us did." On the walk back to the farmhouse, the clouds parted just enough for sunlight to spill across the field, lighting up the snow like crushed diamonds. The children came running out from the barn, red-cheeked and breathless, shouting about hot cocoa and sled races. Charlie stopped when he saw them. "Where'd you two go?" Jack looked down at Eliza. She squeezed his hand once, then turned to the kids. "Just out for a little walk," she said, "to remember where we've been and where we're going." Jack bent down, picked up a snowball, and lobbed it gently at Charlie's feet. "Now enough talk. Who wants to lose in a snowball fight?" The shrieking began before he even finished the sentence. Eliza stood back for a moment, watching Jack run after Rosie and Willa, laughing like a man with nothing left to hide. Charlie whooped as he tackled Jack into a snowbank, and as she stood there, the snow globe still in her hands, Eliza realized something profound. This place, once cold and quiet, had become a heartbeat, steady, strong, Alive again, it began with a hammer, just a single, echoing strike in the early morning stillness. Jack raised it again. Steady, deliberate, driving another nail into the old barn's worn frame. The wood groaned, but it held, like it always had. By midday, the gravel driveway was full. Not with black SUVs this time, but with pickup trucks, utility vans, and station wagons bearing out-of-state plates. Word had spread, not through newspapers or press releases, but through something rarer: gratitude. One of the contractors who stepped out first had a daughter who once spent 6 weeks in a shelter funded by the Monroe Foundation. Another man said his sister had survived thanks to a mental health retreat Eliza quietly funded. A young architect from Boise said he'd followed Eliza's work for years, and if she's building something again, I want to be part of it. No fanfare, no entourage, just people who believed. The barn became the heart of it. Eliza stood inside its cavernous shell, blueprints spread across hay bales, pointing out where new beams would go, where skylights could open up space, where a quiet reading nook for children could sit beneath a loft of old timber. "It's not just a structure," she said to Jack as he leaned against a post, hands covered in sawdust. "It's a beginning." He looked around the space, walls that once echoed with the clatter of feed buckets, the scrape of boots, the silence of winter, and saw something different now. Laughter, learning, healing. "You sure this old place can carry all that?" he asked. She smiled, brushing hair from her face with the back of her gloved hand. "With the right hands, yes." Jack looked down at his palms, scarred, rough, steady, then nodded. Outside, the kids were busy building snowmen along the fence line. Charlie had decided each one should have a name and a job title. "This one's the Chief of Cocoa," he said, adjusting a red scarf around the neck of a lumpy snow figure. "That one's the Head of Hugs." Rosie and Willa giggled, chasing each other through the snow as volunteers passed around thermoses of coffee and toolkits. It didn't look like a construction site. It looked like a celebration, and in many ways it was. Not just of what they were building, but of what had been survived. That afternoon, Jack climbed the ladder to help reinforce one of the upper beams. Eliza stood below, pointing and directing with surprising precision. She had slipped back into that leadership role, but it wasn't the Eliza of press conferences and gala dinners. This was the version stripped of vanity and armor, the version that had lived. "You ever think you'd end up here?" Jack called down, driving a screw into a crossbeam. She looked up, hand shielding her eyes. "Never." "Regret it?" "Not for a second." There was a pause. Then she added, "What about you? You okay sharing your barn with the world?" Jack glanced around at the people working, at the sound of Charlie laughing with the twins, at the warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter sun. "It was never just mine," he said. As dusk settled in, lanterns were hung from beams, casting soft amber light across the frame of what would soon be called the Haven, a name Eliza and Jack had chosen together. Simple, honest, a place where broken things could be mended. In one corner of the barn, a small gathering formed around a chalkboard. Joe, the cowboy hat-wearing project manager, handed out sketch pads to a few local teens. "We want your ideas too," she said. "This place isn't just being built for you, it's being built with you." And that's when Jack understood. This wasn't a favor. It wasn't a debt being paid or a charity extended. It was something shared, built by many hands, held together by kindness and the quiet belief that second chances were worth fighting for. Later that night, as the final nails were hammered and the last thermoses emptied, Jack and Eliza stood outside the barn together. Snow began to fall again, gentle this time, almost reverent. Eliza slipped her arm through his. "You ever wonder how we got here?" "All the time." "And?" Jack looked up at the barn, at the glow spilling through the slats, at the people hugging goodbye and promising to return next week with more materials, more hands, more heart. "Maybe," he said. "Sometimes you don't find miracles. Maybe you build them, one board at a time." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And maybe," she whispered, "you also fall in love along the way." Jack didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He just turned to her, touched her cheek gently, and said the only thing that mattered. "Stay." Her eyes glistened. She nodded once. "I already did." Winter began to loosen its grip by early March. The snow melted in soft ribbons across the fields, revealing patches of frozen earth and last year's brittle grass. The wind, once sharp and punishing, now carried the first hints of spring, mud-scented, full of promise. And the lake, the one that had nearly taken two little girls and returned them to the world in a swirl of frost and miracle, began to thaw. Jack stood at its edge once more, boots pressed into the softening bank, hands tucked into his jacket. The ice was fractured now, slivered with lines, streaked with sky. It looked like a frozen mirror breaking into truth. Behind him, laughter drifted from the barn. Children, tools, voices, hammers, hope, rebuilding itself. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Eliza joined him at the water's edge, her scarf fluttering lightly in the wind, cheeks pink from the chill. In her hands, she carried a folded piece of paper. Her eyes sparkled like morning frost. "I got a letter today," she said. Jack turned toward her curious. "Good news?" She unfolded the paper and handed it to him. It was a certificate issued by the state, with embossed lettering and an official seal. The Haven at Hawthorne Ridge, licensed non-profit center for healing and family restoration, authorized to operate. March 10th, 2025. Jack whistled. "That's official then," she nodded. "We open next week. 6 families already on the waiting list." He handed it back. "They won't find a better place." She smiled, then looked out at the lake. "Funny, isn't it? This is where it all started." He followed her gaze. "I think about that day sometimes," she said quietly. "About how close we came to losing everything. And how, without it, I wouldn't be here." Jack's voice was low. "Some storms take things, but some bring you home." Eliza looked at him then. Really looked. The lines in his face that spoke of weather and worry. The eyes that had seen fire and frost, and still softened when they met hers. "I used to think rescue was something that happened once," she said. "A dramatic moment. But I've learned. It's what we choose every day. To show up, to stay, to keep choosing each other." He didn't say anything. He just reached for her hand and laced his fingers through hers. That afternoon, a crowd gathered near the lake. Small, local, but full of warmth. Jo brought her guitar. One of the teens from the design team painted a mural on the barn wall that read, "Healing happens where hope is fed." A wooden bench was placed beside the water's edge, facing the lake, carved with the names Rosie, Willa, and Charlie, and a single line beneath it. "Because kindness doesn't just save lives, it begins them." Jack had built it himself later in the sanctuary room of the Haven, newly furnished with soft chairs and windows that welcomed the light. Eliza stood in front of a group of donors and friends, her voice steady but full. "I used to believe that safety came from distance, she began, from walls and gates and contracts. But I was wrong. Safety comes from people, from places where your story is heard, not silenced, from hands that reach in, even when they don't know your name. She paused, looked at Jack, then at the children sitting in the front row. This place was born from something terrifying, she said, but it became something extraordinary. And today, we dedicate the haven, not just to the ones who made it out, but to those still looking for the strength to begin again. There were no cameras, no headlines, but there were tears and silence and the unmistakable presence of something sacred. That night, as the last guests trickled out and the stars pressed against the sky like scattered prayers, Jack took Eliza's hand and led her back toward the lake. "Come with me," he said. She followed without hesitation. They stopped at the same bench. A soft layer of frost had settled on the top rail, glittering in the moonlight. Jack turned to her, pulled something small from his coat pocket. A ring. Simple. No diamond, just a narrow band of silver, engraved with the words, "Still here." He held it out. "I don't need a church. I don't need vows. I just need this. You, me, choosing this, again and again." Eliza stared at it, eyes filling. Yes. He slipped it onto her finger, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the echoes of things once broken, they began again. In the farmhouse, the children were asleep. Charlie snuggled against Rosie, Willa hugging her wooden zoo animals, the fire casting shadows that looked like angels. And outside, beneath the sky no longer heavy with snow, a lake once frozen, now whispered as it melted. Not with noise, but with life. Because sometimes miracles don't come loud or sudden. Sometimes they arrive in silence, in kindness, in a second chance. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop us a comment below and let us know your city or country. It's always a joy to see how far kindness travels. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, true inspired moments that restore faith and celebrate second chances, please consider subscribing to our channel.